Ozkizilcik. He's a security analyst and a non-residential fellow at the Atlantic Council and joins me live now from the Turkish capital, Ankara. Thank you so much for being with us on the program. Let me get your thoughts and your analysis on this visit from the foreign ministers of Germany and France. What do you think is going to come from it?
So I think this visit marks an important milestone in Syria's future because, let's be honest, Syria needs to be rebuilt. The country is in a ruin and the Assad regime basically destroyed the country. So it needs to be rebuilt up. And even though the Syrians are quite willing, they need funding. There will be a huge funding gap for Syria. Some estimates range from 300 billion to almost 500 billion of the need. And the European Union, alongside the Arab states, are the most probable donors and the funding sources for the rebuilding and reconstruction of Syria. And to enable this, the French and the Germans are the most important partners here, as the European Union is basically led by these two powerful nations. And their visit may pave the way forward for the Europeans and the Western states to get involved in the reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria. And I think that today's meeting was an initial step taken to pre-speak and pre-negotiate some conditions for Western support, as we have seen. I think that the Europeans have sent some signals that their support will be conditional and not without any conditions.
So what do you make of the conversations being held around these sanctions? Because that's clearly very important for the uplifting of the civil society in Syria and for that rebuilding process. How soon do you think the EU will lift those sanctions from both Sharaa and Syria itself?
So we have to see here, differentiate it clearly. There are sanctions regarding Syria and sanctions regarding Sharaa and HDS. The sanctions regarding Syria were being implemented because of the Assad regime. It's a tool to influence behavioral change in Syria. This does not work out, but however, these sanctions are still being implemented. And unfortunately, it is against the self-interest of the European Union to push for a more inclusive transition to have these sanctions still in place. Because as long as the sanctions are in place, it will only increase the decrease the efforts of the Syrian society, the Syrian civil NGOs to rebuild the country. So they need more support from outside. And as long as the sanctions are still implemented, this will only make Syria less stable and will prevent a more inclusive government to be established. So the European Union is unfortunately thinking in reverse. It thinks that if the sanctions are being implemented and conditioned to some other demands, political demands like inclusive government, etc., then it will lead towards an inclusive government. Or the reality is, if the sanctions are being lifted on Syria, I'm not speaking about HDS sanctions and Sharaa sanctions, then this will empower the Syrian people that can be part of Syria's future. If they are not empowered, who will be there to be inside the inclusive government and to be strong enough to take a leading role in Syria's future?
One of the conditions that Baerbock mentioned was the representation of minorities in the country. And as we know, Syria is a very, very diverse country with people of different tribes, cultures, religions, backgrounds. Is it going to be a challenge for the new administration to create that unity among the country?
So let me be clear. The representation of minorities per se is, I do not think, the right way to argument here. The right way to argument here should be the representation of the Syrian people altogether. There should be mechanisms for all Syrians to take part. If there's only a mechanism that would ensure that the minorities are somehow represented, but the Syrian people in their majority are not, then the effect will not be that we want. So I think the line of argumentation, the arguments being established here by the West is miscommunicated. I think they should change the attitude towards the representation of the Syrian people. And only if that is achieved, then we will see prosperity, stability, and security in Syria. And here, I think the Syrian minorities will also have their best interests secured if the Syrian people are represented. This is the main issue. The Syrian people need to be able to determine who rules their country and how they rule their country.
Indeed. Omer Ozkizilcik, thank you so much for sharing that analysis with us here on the NewsHour. I appreciate it.